All right, so we're talking this week with our online class about Chopin's novel, The Awakening. It's a fairly short novel, kind of more modern than what we've been reading, so hopefully it's a little bit easier read for you, even though it's a novel in such a short space. Naturally, one of the things that we can do is pick up where we left off with the other works, the thread that we were kind of exploring regarding marriage, and in this case, the Victorian era, which of course is what the novel Little Women is written in, is the Victorian era. So that novel dealt a lot with the question of social class and which is the appropriate social class for which into which one should marry, or what should you aspire to, especially for young women. We're going to get to in class next week. We're going to get to the short piece that's actually a collection of longer works, but we treat it as a short story of its own, called The Storm by Kate Chopin, which is quite scandalous, even more scandalous than this novel. And this novel was a scandalous novel. This was one that was considered by many critics to be absolutely abhorrent. It was very roundly condemned, castigated by critics, and was not terribly popularly received at all. Some people, I think, had the wisdom and foresight to say, well, now, not sure I agree with everything in the novel, but it certainly raises important points. And one of the big points it raises is about something we haven't really talked about so far in the literature that we've been reading, and that is the question not of marriage as a social vehicle, not of marriage as a sort of contract or a socially or religiously acceptable institution, but instead marriage and where it falls in the pursuit of personal fulfillment. Okay, because that is really the heart of this novel. I mean, remember the title of the work. This is The Awakening. Whose awakening? Well, obviously Edna's. Potentially, I would argue Chopin's also trying to awaken the reader, but we can go there later if you want to. But, the issue of marriage as being something that's supposed to personally, psychologically, emotionally fulfill you is kind of a newer concept in the Victorian era, honestly. I think Fuller tried to reach that with her relationship, real life relationship, but it's not something that's talked about in Rosen. It's, happiness is not like ultimate fulfillment. Happiness is having children and, being socially accepted, doing your duty, prospering, material prosperity, all those things. It's a little bit more spiritualized with Little Women because it's a highly moralistic piece. So marriage is a vehicle for not only, rising in social class, but also rising morally. But this is quite different. This is about who am I as a person and how does marriage contribute to that or hold that back, okay? So the question I have for you is, how does this issue of fulfillment manifest itself in the novel? What is it that is missing from the Pontelliers' marriage? It's not kids. They have kids, not money. They got plenty of money. They've got plenty of social status. They're very well admired in their community. They're leaders in their community. It certainly isn't affection or fondness for the most part. I mean, I think if you describe their relationship, you would say that there is some affection, some fondness that they have for one another, but it's hardly a hot, steamy romance. That's not happening at all. There's some of that, or they wouldn't have children, okay, or maybe not, I don't know. But it's very clear, I think, by the novel's ending that fulfillment isn't necessarily either romantic or relational. In other words, what she needs in her life, what's missing from her life, isn't just romance. You're very tempted early on to say, oh, well, there's no passion in her life. But I'm not so sure that passion is what she's looking for here. Again, this is so subjective. We'll all have different opinions. I hope in our discussion threads you'll air your opinion, because I'd be interested in hearing it. This is one of the great things about a work of art, or especially a work of fiction, is that several people can see it and several people can walk away with different impressions. And that's what makes it so great. I do not think that the case can be made that the fulfillment that she's looking for and not receiving is necessarily romantic or relational. I don't know what you would call it, but even if she were to I mean, she has a romantic relationship. She has a sexual relationship. She has a sexual relationship with Alcée. She has a romantic relationship with Robert. She has a socially upstanding, traditional relationship with her husband. I mean, she's got relationships, and she's got one she can choose if she wants to. And in the end, she doesn't. None of them will fulfill her. So I don't think it's, in my opinion, I don't think this is a novel about seeking fulfillment through a relationship, romantic or otherwise. Robert and Alcée are just not the answer to her lack of happiness. There's something else going on here. These kinds of relationships are more temptations or traps than they are the answer to their problem. You ever met anybody who's just like a serial relationship person? They get married like 7 times, or they're always dating somebody new all the time. And you get this sense that, I don't think one more relationship is what you really need. I don't think it's a matter of, on the 12th girlfriend or boyfriend, I'm sure that'll do the trick. There's something else going on in their life that's lacking. And I think that by the end of the novel, maybe early in the novel, we think, well, she just hasn't found the right guy, etc. But by the end of the novel, I think we become much more aware of the fact that no, there's something bigger here. Now we can ask the question, what is bigger that's missing from Edna's life? But I don't think it's that she hasn't met the right dude or has the right kind of relationship. It's also equally clear, I think, from the encounters with and the relationship she has with Madame Reese, that art is something she loves. You remember, she kind of rediscovers what she loved in her youth. A lot of us will do that. You'll see. Some of you guys are super young, but you'll see that later in life you'll kind of rediscover something you really loved when you were younger, and it gives you a great deal of joy and maybe a little bit of a nostalgia, and say, oh, I used to love doing that. That's a lot of fun. I'm going to take that back up again. And art for her is something that really does. So all of a sudden, just as soon as you think, well, if she just meets the right fella, then she'll have fulfillment. Well, no, not that kind of fellow. Maybe another kind of fellow, and that'll be fulfillment. Well, maybe it's not fellows. Maybe it's art. Yes, art. Noble pursuit, art, right? Okay, higher than that. Why? We're not corporal beings. We're spiritual beings. Art is how we express our spirituality, and yet art doesn't seem to do it for her either. So there's something else. There's something else going on here, and I'm interested in finding out what you think it is. I've got some ideas of my own, but I've read it about 20 times, so I still haven't come to a firm conclusion. So we'll see what you think. I think this obviously would have been a very difficult novel for a lot of women to relate to. A lot of women who had very traditional values and traditional upbringings and very conventional ways of looking at marriage. Marriage is sort of a traditional social, religious duty, would not have been very fond of this novel, and weren't. It was quite roundly condemned. It was more ignored than condemned, though, I'll be honest with you. But there would have been a lot of women who, even if they couldn't speak out about how much they identified with this character or her difficulties, would have had some sympathy for her. So I don't want you to think that she wrote this in the face of universal condemnation, or that everybody thought it was a wonderful novel and was progressive and all of those kinds of things, because I think she caught fire from one end, and what few people, I think, who really understood what she was saying and sympathized with her probably were not allowed to really exercise their speech on it. In some ways, Chopin is, this does bother me. Chopin has been held up for many, many years as an early feminist icon, an early feminist writer. And I don't think there's any doubt that that's the case, depending on how you define feminism, for example. But there's a concern here in my mind that Chopin, the feminist, sort of eclipses Chopin, the writer. Chopin would have said she's a writer first, who happens to, she wouldn't have understood the term in the same way we do. She wouldn't have used this term, a feminist, afterwards. She's trying to write great fiction. It's our values, our sort of awareness, our ideology, if you will, that has sort of picked her up and used her for certain things. That's a different question, but I think it's a novel. In other words, it's a novel really about people and not about causes. And I don't want us to lose the focus on that, because a lot of the criticism that you read, a lot of the scholarly work that you read, is always talking about how she's a champion of feminism and whatnot. But she's really concerned with people and with her art first. And she's making points through them, yes, and they're important points. But let's not lose lose track of what she's trying to do here. What she's presenting us with are people who have moral choices. Robert and Edna have a moral choice, obviously. Edna and Leonce have a moral choice that they have to make. Edna has a moral choice that she has to make regarding her children. That's a tough one, you see, because you know this. Women are judged much more harshly with respect to their children and how they relate to them and how they raise them than men are sometimes, and there's a double standard. There always has been. And some people would say, well, there's biology involved there. Well, okay. But regardless, however you feel about that, certainly there's a moral issue of a woman in the late 19th century making a decision, should I leave my family? And that includes my children, because my husband will be the one who gets custody and will raise them, and I will be a pariah. I will be an outcast. No court in the land will allow me to have any interaction with my children after I go, if I choose to do that. So there's a moral question there about what about my children. And then, of course, it's a novel that deals with people who are trapped inside of institutions that don't allow for individuality. I think, in my opinion, I think that's getting closer to the nugget or the core of the novel's main thrust, is marriage as an institution was one certainly that Chopin did not find very fulfilling at all. She found it stifling as can be. She had terrible relationships in her life, particularly in her marriage. And you can look all that up, but that's not for today. But certainly in the novel itself, marriage is an institution that seems to have Edna very trapped, and it's not for everyone. That's a given. But when you find yourself in one because it's what you've been told all your life that that's what you're supposed to aspire to, and then you don't find fulfillment, it isn't necessarily just being married that isn't fulfilling. It's that the institution and its obligations may prevent you from fulfilling your own individuality, however you define that. Anyway, it's a very deep novel, I think. And it's, a lot of people are like, oh, well, she just didn't like her husband. She was bored, and so she took flings on, and then she, decided to end it all. Well, that's a little simplistic, because I think you're selling Chopin short if you don't delve into the very serious. And plus, and then a lot of us don't sympathize with Edna. You really will not sympathize with the characters in the short story The Storm. Many of you won't, I assume, because, ultimately, most of us don't think adultery is a good idea. And I'm unabashedly in that camp. I don't think it's a good idea at all. But I think Chopin is trying to show us something without preconceived notions of what if it's okay for some people. I don't think so, but I'm not here to tell them what they can or can't do. Free country, So, to continue on with this, I think it's also a novel that obviously presents us with Edna's artistic impulse. Why does this emerge when it does? She sort of rediscovers this, doesn't she? And I think it's an attempt to recapture something that she liked about her youth. So let's say that you're married to a guy, and all of a sudden he takes up, building model cars, the ones with the glue and you put together in the little plastic model cars. And he did it when he was like 9 or 10 or 12 years old or something. And he hasn't touched it for years. And all of a sudden he's 35 or 40 and he's doing this again. Why is he doing that? Well, okay, so sometimes people just re-explore their hobbies of youth when they actually have a little bit more money and time to really pursue them. Well, okay, that's fine. But it could be something else. It could be that he misses something about his youth, right? That there are associations with that hobby. You see, things you associate. I associate happiness, freedom, optimism, all those things associated with youth. That it's not so much the pursuit itself as it is that it reminds us of something from our past. Maybe that's what it is, because it emerges at a point where she's really at a very low point psychologically and emotionally. Her decision to move out and go her own way and to have a party over it, which is really something else. That is the move. By the way, Edna's moving out would have been considered almost as scandalous with many of these readers as her dalliances with Alcée and with Robert. Just the very idea of moving out and just leaving her family would have been just considered utterly anathema. What does it signify? It signifies that she's given up on the marriage, whether anybody else has or not. She has left, some would say, abandoned her sphere of influence. Remember we talked about this in the 18th and 19th century. There was this notion that men's place was in the workplace and women's area or sphere of influence, their area that they controlled, okay, and that they defined and that they shaped and that they influenced, was the home, the domestic realm, okay? Everything from the way the home operated to meals to childcare to all of that. So that was her domain, okay? And it defined a woman how your domain was set up. You go and visit someone's home and you saw their family and you interacted with them and you visited with them and you walked away from that with an impression of who that woman was and what she valued and what she prized. Sounds weird because it sounds very judgmental, but sorry, kind of was. But there was this idea that men have their world and women have theirs. And this is her world, right? Rightfully, she has her world, which is her domestic home, family, children, life. And she just walks away from it and says, I want another one. And then this one is an empty home, right? One without children and a husband. This would have been considered very, very awful in the minds of a lot of upper or middle class women reading the novel. They would have not sympathized with this at all. How dare you leave the people that mean the most to you? Public scrutiny was a lot greater back then. Small circles of friends were with much greater and more significant contact really influenced how you behaved. Some of you grew up in small towns and you knew everybody in the small town, or you went to a small high school and everybody knew each other, or you were part of a small community or part of a very plugged in community, maybe a church or civic organization that you were very active with, your family was very active with. It was fairly small and everybody knew each other, right? And so in those kinds of small circles, social pressure is much more intense. I would argue that one of the reasons why we seem to be a little bit less caring for our neighbors these days in the 21st century, a little bit more hardened and callous when it comes to compassion for our fellow human beings, is because we live, a lot of us, in very large urban areas where, it's kind of ironic. The more people you're around, the less you seem to be involved with each other. It's kind of an odd thing. You live in a small town where people are spread out, and there aren't a lot of people, and they tend to take care of each other, but they also tend to poke their nose into your business, okay? I often tell this little story. It's kind of an interesting one. I lived in a town of about 7,000 people, and I had lived there for about three or four months, and it was surprising how many of them knew me when I hadn't even introduced myself to them. They knew who I was. They knew where I worked. The guy at the dry cleaning store, one day I came to pick up my uniforms, so I was teaching at VMI, and I said, I forgot my checkbook. And he said, that's okay, I know where you work. You can come back and pay me next week. Wow, really? Because that would not have happened in a major city like Dallas. Would not have happened. I went to a grocery store and I'm checking out, and this lady at the checkout line said, that's not the coffee you usually buy. What? Have you been stalking me in my basket? What's going on here? But people know you. Now my wife and I, about 7 years ago, moved to a rural area, and we all live on like 2 to 5 acre lots. I mean, there aren't a whole lot of people out here. You see people walking in the neighborhood every now and then, but you wave at people. You care about people. When the ice storm and the blizzard last year, we went and checked on each other because there's an older couple down the road, and you're like, well, I hadn't heard from them in a couple of days. We better check, make sure they're okay because we've been losing power. That kind of stuff happens in small areas. So our world, many of us, we live in much larger worlds and more densely populated worlds, which ironically can lead you to feel less social pressure, less, not more. If you went to a big enough high school, they had enough groups that no matter what you were interested in, you could join that group probably. But if you go to a small high school, you can feel quite alienated if you're the one kid that's different, okay? And you can feel a lot of pressure from those people who have a lot more scrutiny on you. That's one reason why Léonce has to keep up appearances. Well, I heard that Edna is moved. How's that? Oh, the house is getting renovated. So I mean that's a big deal, right? Whereas if you live in a large city and nobody knows you, why would you bother coming up and concocting some excuse for that? You wouldn't care. Léonce himself is kind of worthy of consideration, I think, because how he's presented and how you view him as a character. It's very easy for you to dive in and say, well, he's just this unsympathetic fella. He just is uncaring. He is what he is. He is, in his mind, what he is supposed to be. And that's more important. He's what he is. You and I might look at him and say, he just does not get her. And he just does not understand. He is not there for her. He does not support her as he should. All those kinds of things. But he's who he is. He's the product of what he's been raised to be. And in his mind, he is doing everything he's supposed to do as a husband and a father. You and I might say, well, that's not enough. And he says, yeah, but that's what I signed up for. And that's what I was raised to do. I mean, years ago, men weren't terribly active in their families and the children that they raised. They were quite distant. You're looking at this particular individual here, Leonce, as being a product of that. How is he supposed to be something that he was not raised to be, and it's never occurred to him that he ought to be any different? He's doing what he thinks he's supposed to be doing. Doesn't Leonce want fulfillment? He doesn't find fulfillment in anything other than the role that he has. Edna, quite different. She's fulfilling her role and doing well, but she doesn't find that be as enough. So, I mean, you can cast him as a villain because in many ways he's very cold and uncaring, and that's not good, and we don't like that. But on the other hand, what do you expect? It's the kind of person he was raised to be. So at the end of the day, she's faced with several choices. What does she want to do with her life? What does she do? Adele would say, hey, fake it. Just get by. This is life. You're not going to achieve fulfillment. Just fake it. Just act as though you're fulfilled and then go do your own thing, and nobody will be the wiser. Robert says, throw it all away and run away with me. Fulfillment is about, just going with your heart and forgetting all these other things. She can't do that. She's tempted because she has feelings for him, but she can't do that. I'll say is all about sexual freedom. Well, okay, there's not much more to it than that, honestly. That's all she sees in him and probably all he sees in her. So that seems shallow, unfulfilling, right? So she doesn't choose that. Reese says escape into art, but clearly, as much as she loves art, it's not what's going to fulfill her either. And Leonce is, well, just accept things the way they are, and she cannot do that. She can't go back to that. So she has no great choices here. Okay. This is a very sophisticated novel. This is really one, and it's the first novel, I would argue, in American literature that presents us with a female character who is fully mature, fully thoughtful, fully psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, at a very high level, and presents us with serious questions about her life. Not stereotypes, not shallow, not two-dimensional, but a truly three-dimensional woman who's going through a psychological and a sort of spiritual moral crisis in her life about why am I here and why am I not happy? So the ending, everybody talks about the ending, right? The problematic ending. She swims out into the ocean, and that's the end. You don't see the dead body, you don't see the drowning, but you know what's going to happen. And there's no question. I mean, there's some people who like to say, well, no, maybe Chopin just left off a chapter where she swims back, and no, she doesn't. She doesn't show us the exact consequences of the attempt at suicide, but we know what they are, right? She doesn't have to. Is the suicide, however, an act of defiance or despair? Does she do this because she says, I just can't go on because there's no option for me to achieve happiness in this life? All those people and all those choices, none of them will work for me. Sexual dalliance and running away with Robert, or just staying put, or just faking my happiness, or escaping into art. None of these is going to give me fulfillment in my life in a deeper psychological or spiritual sense. And so I'm sad, and I don't want to go on if that's the case. Or is it a protest of sorts? Is it a statement that she's making? Is this sort of a triumph? Is this a sort of triumph over circumstances? Or is it a surrender? Is it a cop-out? What are we to make of it? What's Chopin trying to tell us? I think it's deliberately ambiguous. that's just my bias here. I think she's letting you decide what you think it would be. It could be either. I don't know. But I think she's letting you decide, having gotten to know the character of Edna, you walk away with your conclusion about it. Really, the only voice of objectivity, if you can call it that, through the novel is Manderley, Dr. Manderley, who is trying to help her. But I think he feels very powerless in being able to do it because he knows that all the choices are hers. He can't do a thing, right? He can't stop her from doing destructive things. He can't guide her towards the right thing to do because he doesn't know what she considers to be the right thing to do because she doesn't know that. He's not surprised, I think, by the ending. I don't think he'd be surprised by it. But at the same time, is this something to be... Is this a shaking of a fist against the establishment, against institutions that are too confining, like marriage as it was conceived in the 19th century? She has nothing to say about 21st century marriage. She never experienced it. Okay, but marriage of that era, is this a shaking of the fist and saying I'd rather die than be a part of something that smothers you like this and that straps you in like it does, or is it just a sad resignation that there are some people who are deep enough, sensitive enough, awakening enough to say the limitations of institutions like marriage in this world for people like me just are too great a burden. Excuse me. We'll let that be the subject of our discussion online, okay, in our Canvas discussion, as well as another one, probably I'll throw another one up there, I may not, about the use of symbolism in this text, because there's quite a bit of it, and you can kind of run with that if you'd like to. But I certainly want to spend some time after we talk about the storm on Thursday addressing this question. This is this is very much unlike Rosen. This is a lot more like Fuller, isn't it? I mean, Fuller tells you about her spiritual crisis as a kid, but she doesn't get into her adult life. But you can imagine. You can only imagine that there were many women who did not find happiness and fulfillment in what society told them was supposed to be the thing that led them to fulfillment. I mean, imagine all your life you were told, well, once you're married, you're going to be super happy and everything's going to be great and it's going to be just, bells and whistles and parties and happy, happy, happy every day. And then you wake up and you go, oh, it's not that. Well, are you miserable? Is he mean to you? Well, no, he's not mean to me. I'm not miserable, but it's not all that. And in fact, in a lot of ways, it makes me feel like it's a burden in some ways. I'm tied down to it. Imagine the disappointment that a lot of women had. However, I would also encourage you to read a book, if you ever get a chance, called Searching the Heart. It's a wonderful book where a woman went back and just looked at the diaries and letters of average middle-class 19th century women, most of whom had wonderful relationships with their husbands. I mean, there were some bad marriages. There's no question about it. Chopin had one. There were some bad relationships. There were some women who felt just terrible and trapped in their marriage relationship. However, I don't think that was the norm. I really don't. I think the majority of people did find a way to find happiness in their marriages, even though society placed a whole lot of expectations on top of you. This is the thing that's going to make you happy. This is the thing that's going to make you feel like you're a real member of society, a mature member of society. This is the thing that all of your youth is pointed towards. And then suddenly, for some people, it ends up kind of not being that. I mean, imagine, especially if, your particular sexual preference was kind of up in the air, or you didn't know, right? You didn't know how you felt about men or women or whatever. I can only imagine that would have been a very confusing and difficult and frustrating thing for some of those folks. Be that as it may, we're going to go to Canvas and we're going to click on the discussion button and begin our discussion. I'd like you to finish up those posts, if you would, just your thoughts. You don't have to respond to everybody else's unless you want to. That's okay too. With the posts that are up there. And please do that prior to Tuesday at midnight. And also our quiz would be these two questions. Send those to my email, as you have been doing. Question number one: what country does Robert run off to? He leaves the United States. Where does he go? Right? Where does he go? What country does he go to? And then the second thing is, what excuse does Leonce make to his friends to account for Edna's having moved out? Right? He's got to kind of cover for what is considered a fairly socially embarrassing thing. His wife moves out. What story does he concoct about that? The quiz by Tuesday at midnight, the discussion posts by Tuesday at midnight, and we will see you on Thursday in class. Have a great weekend.